I didn't see you there. I was reading one of Asimov's robot stories, as I do every night before going to bed, and it got me thinking. When it comes to robot stories in science fiction, Isaac Asimov is the name that comes to mind most of the time. He's the classic, the big daddy of robots, if you will. I mean, everybody knows Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. 1, a robot may never injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. I would guess far more people are aware of the 3 laws of robotics than with the stories themselves. Their reputation kind of precedes them, although iRobot is still in print, still in bookstores, so I would guess it's probably more widely read. I don't really know. I think the rest of Asimov's robot story, which is the majority of them, of course, iRobot is only 8 stories, are far less popular. At least that would be my guess. Funny enough, of all Asimov's robot story, the ones in iRobot are not really my favorite. Some of the later ones that he wrote are, in my humble opinion, much better, but that's neither here nor there. You can't deny the book's role in popularizing the robot as a subgenre within and outside of science fiction fandom, and I'm talking about iRobot here. They even made a mediocre Will Smith movie, for God's sakes. If that's not a sign of success, I don't know what is. To make a long story short, Asimov's name, and iRobot in particular, will forever be linked with the robot genre in science fiction. That's history for you. Having said that, no writer is an island. We all stand on the shoulder of giants, and Asimov, more than anybody, was always willing to acknowledge his inspirations. So this got me thinking, what were Asimov's main inspiration for his robot series, for writing the first robot story that he wrote in 1940, Robbie, and the stories that he wrote afterwards? In the tiny world that was science fiction of the early 20th century, the robot was already an established trope, a character archetype, a subgenre, or whatever you want to call it. A trope is, I guess, good enough. In the introduction to one of his robot collections, The Rest of Robots, Asimov makes the case that the trope goes all the way back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I suppose you could say that Frankenstein was the first robot story, in quotes. Not only from a scientific and technological point of view, we can consider Frankenstein's monster as a sort of a fleshy robot, but more importantly, Shelley's Frankenstein established a thematic blueprint of sorts that a lot of robot stories followed in the early 20th century. You know, a smart but foolish scientist creates artificial life, then something goes wrong, and that creation turns against its creator, more or less. We see this prominently in RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, the 1920 play by Czech writer Karel Capek, which coined the phrase, or the term, robot, meaning worker in the Czech language. Capek's robots were slaves used for labor who then rebel and, spoiler alert, pretty much destroy the human race. More or less a variation on the Frankenstein story with a proletariat twist. In my neck of the woods, we call that a Wednesday. Anyway, this kind of story continued in the pulp era of science fiction throughout the 1920s and 1930s, a trope which, in Asimov's words, got pretty tiring eventually. To quote his introduction from The Rest of the Robots, "With all this in mind, I began in 1940 to write robot stories of my own, but robot stories of a new variety. Never was of my own robots to turn stupidly on his creator for no purpose but to demonstrate for one more weary time the crime and punishment of Faust. Nonsense. My robots were machines designed by engineers, not pseudo-men created by blasphemers. My robots reacted along rational lines that existed in their brains from the moment of construction." And that's how the 3 laws of robotics came about, to ensure that he would never fall into that Frankenstein trap. In Asimov's universe, the laws of robotics are not just software rules that are coded into the robots. Rather, they are these quasi-natural laws fundamental to how the positronic brains functions. They cannot be bypassed. You cannot design a robot that violates these 3 laws, just like you cannot build a car that violates Newton's laws of motion. However, Asimov was not the first. He wrote his first robot story in 1940, but almost a decade before, other authors had also grown tired of the same old tropes and sought to explore other types of machine man. In this video, I will explore some of those stories and authors and how they may have inspired Asimov. The first stop in our little journey is the Jameson satellite. by Neil R. Jones, published in the July 1932 issue of Amazing Stories. The story is about the titular Professor Jameson, who wants to preserve his body after death for eternity. He doesn't want to live forever, mind you. He simply wants to preserve his physical body after death. Why? I don't really know. It's never really explained. He does this by launching himself inside a rocket into space, the Jameson satellite, which orbits the planets for millions of years until the sun has started to transform into a red giant, humanity has died, and Earth has become nothing but a boiling hunk of rock floating in space. The science is not really accurate, but I think it was consistent at the time in the 1930s, so whatever. While floating dead in space, Jameson, or rather Jameson's body, is discovered by the Zoroms, an alien race that used to be flesh and blood but achieved immortality through the transferring of their brains into machines, i.e. robots. They don't call them robots, but that's what essentially they are. They spend their immortality exploring the galaxy, having fun adventures, etc. Very Star Trek style, actually. And that's how they find our solar system, and in it, Jameson's perfectly preserved body. They find that they are able to save his brain and transfer it into a machine body, and so now he too is an immortal being. Confronted with this new reality, Professor Jameson explores what's left of the dead Earth, contemplates whether he wants to go on fun adventures with the Zoroms or end his life. Thankfully, he decides the former, and on we go. The Jameson satellite was published at Amazing under the editorship of Thomas Sloan, who had just taken over from Hugo Gernsback. Unfortunately, this was not a great period for the magazine. Sloan was a flawed editor, to say the least, and didn't necessarily have a great eye for talent. He did get some memorable stories published, like Professor Jameson, but he also accepted some truly terrible ones. Ironically, the Jameson satellite is an example of both. It's not a very well-written story. It's actually quite bad, in a desperate need of an editor, if you could believe that. In addition to some strange and awkward word choices, the first 70% of the story is one large info dump. The prose is dry and passive, there's little characterization to speak of, and for all that info dumping, the world building is kind of uninteresting. At the same time, there's an unquestionable pulpy charm to the story, or more accurately, a sense of awe about the scale of Professor Jameson's fate. His dilemma at the end of the story is effective and emotionally resonates. More importantly, the story does wrestle with some innovative science fiction ideas, something that many science fiction readers of the time valued probably above all other flaws that the story has. I suspect that's what made it popular among contemporary readers, which led to the author, Neil Jones, to turn it into a series. He wrote several Professor Jameson stories featuring the wacky space adventures of him and the Zoroms. I read a few of them, and they definitely improve as he writes more stories. They're much better written than the first one. Clearly, he improved his craft over the years, and they're also a little bit more action-packed. They don't have sort of like the passivity of the first story, but they do explore some interesting science fiction ideas along the way. And Jones is not afraid to get weird with it and feature some truly alien creatures and some truly alien words. Going back to the topic of the video, i.e. robots, you could make the case that the Professor Jameson stories are not really robot stories. It's not about artificial life per se, but rather natural life, the brain, being transported into an artificial body. It's more connected with the cyberpunk subgenre, you could make the case, which, we won't see in science fiction for a few more decades. It's also possibly the first ever story to explore the idea of transhumanism, which is arguably another cyberpunk idea, and I don't really see it given much credit for this. The story does touch upon some of the philosophical quandaries of transhumanism, as the character of Professor Jameson ponders several times in the series about the nature of this new kind of existence. It even gets quite dark at times. Nevertheless, that is tangentially related to the concept of a robot, so I don't think it's that unreasonable to lump it into this category. Asimov himself readily admits that he was inspired by the Zoroms. More important still were Jones's Zoroms, who were robots really. Their organic brains were just a detail. Jones treated them as mechanical men, making them objective without being unfeeling, benevolent without being busybodies. They made no effort to use force to keep Professor Jameson from committing suicide if he really wanted to, but they did use dignified persuasion. It is from the Zoroms, beginning with their first appearance in the Jameson satellite, that I got my own feeling for benevolent robots who could serve men with decency, as these had served Professor Jameson. It was the Zoroms then who were the spiritual ancestors of my own positronic robots, all of them from Robbie to R. Daniel. Also in Amazing Stories, in April of 1932, John Wyndham published The Lost Machine. In this one, Wyndham tells the story of a Martian robot that lands accidentally on Earth. Despite the robot's general harmlessness, it faces near unilateral hostility and barbarism from the Earthlings, from humans, I suppose. Eventually, he does find some kindness with the woman he rescues and her scientist father, but realizing that humans could study him and copy his advanced inner workings, the robot decides to destroy himself, as he does not think our backward species is ready for this type of advanced technology. Wyndham is probably the most popular of the writers in this list, aside from Asimov, obviously. He was a British science fiction author who would find a lot of success in the 50s and the 60s with novels such as The Day of the Triffids and The Midwich Cuckoo, both of which received movie adaptation. The Lost Machine, this story, was significantly earlier in his career, though his talent as a writer is pretty evident, I think. The story is well written, with a certain wit and plenty of entertainment value. Wyndham relies on what is essentially an inversion of the Frankenstein trope, with a little bit of Pinocchio and even the Elephant Man thrown in there. The villagers chase the monster, but it never really turns on them. The robot is the ultimate pacifist, despite the unending cruelty of our species. In the end, it takes its own life rather than resorting to violence, however futile that might be. The Lost Machine is an example of the benevolent robot trope that sort of started to emerge in the 1930s. And also, I believe it might be the first of the robot stories to be narrated in the first person from the point of view of the robot, although I can't be 100% sure of that. It is nevertheless an important device that encourages the reader to sympathize with the machine, unlike most of robot stories that came before it. I did not find any direct quotes from Asimov referencing this story as inspiration, but as a voracious reader of science fiction during the 30s, I can only assume that he must have read it. Lester Del Rey published Helen O'Loy in the December 1938 issue of Astounding Science Fiction, which at the time, under the new editorship of John W. Campbell, was starting to emerge as a leading science fiction magazine. A play on the words Helen of Troy, Helen O'Loy involves two best friends, Phil, who is an endocrinologist, also the narrator of the story, and Dave, who is an engineer, who both decide to create the perfect housekeeping robot, one which responds realistically and with appropriate emotions to every situation. The titular Helen is the result of their experiment, perfect in every way, but with one unforeseen consequence. She falls hopelessly in love with Dave. Dave, on his part, is initially repulsed at the idea of love with a mechanical creation and runs away from it. Eventually, though, he acquiesces and realizes that Helen is the perfect woman, flawless in every way other than the fact that she can't really have any children, which doesn't seem to bother him anyway. They get married and they live a happy life in the countryside or whatever. Dave grows old and he eventually dies of a bad heart. And in a last display of true love, Helen, who is kind of immortal, of course, she is a robot, asks Phil, the friend, to also end her life so she can be buried next to her beloved. Phil agrees to do her this favor. In the last paragraph of the story, it is revealed that Phil never married and never had children because no real woman could ever measure up to the perfection that was Helen O'Loy. There was only one Helen O'Loy. There's an interesting connection between Helen O'Loy and Asimov. When Asimov tried to sell his first robot story to Astounding, Robbie, in 1940, the editor John W. Campbell rejected it because it was, according to him, too similar to Helen O'Loy. I could not disagree more with Campbell on this, and I don't really understand how he could have thought that. These are not similar stories at all. I suppose they both kind of deal with humans who are overly attached to robots, but that similarity is so superficial as to be effectively relevant. And it happens very differently in both stories. Plus, the writing styles are also very different. Helen O'Loy is much more mature, it references sex at various points, and deals with death towards the end, whereas Asimov's story, Robbie, is very child-friendly, to put it mildly. On top of that, there was a 2-year separation between the two stories. Sure, Helen O'Loy was popular at the time, but 2 years is a long time for a magazine that publishes monthly. So I don't really know what he was thinking. None of this really makes any sense. The two stories could not be more different, not only in subject, but also in quality. Of all the stories that I read in preparation for this video, Helen O'Loy is easily the best one, by a wide margin. It's not even close. I would even argue that it's better than any of the robot stories that Asimov wrote throughout his career, at least as works of fiction. Asimov's strength was always the philosophical side, the philosophical exploration of complex ideas, more than his literary merit, although he does get better over time, I think. So it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison between the two, but even in that department, Helen O'Loy is certainly no slouch. This was my first time reading the story, and it kind of blew my mind. I don't think I've read anything else by Lester Del Rey. I know him more as an editor and a publisher more than a writer, but if this is an indication of what he's capable of or what his talents are, then I should definitely read more from him. There is a wit and an economy of words in Del Rey's writing that I found endearing. It reminded me of those hard-boiled stories from the same era, the fiction of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and the like. This style, the sharpness and playfulness of the prose, really helps sell the subjectivity of the first-person narration, which in my opinion is crucial to understanding the story. It's important to realize that the story is told specifically through the eyes of one of its characters who has a certain point of view and exists in a certain context. And I really loved the ending. In all the silliness and the what-if scenarios, the story is fundamentally a tragedy, with both characters kind of throwing their lives away. Reading some of the criticism of Helen O'Loy over the years really surprised me. Again, I knew very little about the story, just that it was sort of a classic of the time, so I assume it probably got good reviews, but the reality is only kinda. While it was popular during its publication and has been anthologized several times, later critics have also described it as problematic, chauvinistic, disrespectful to women, anti-feminist, or to use fancier language, it is the kind of story that typifies an exploitative male gaze. I can understand on a surface level why these criticisms exist and where they come from. It is, after all, a story about constructing the perfect woman, literally as an object, described in stereotyping terms and made to be subservient and slavishly devoted to a man. Moreover, a lot of science fiction of the time was actually like that. A lot of it was genuinely sexist and misogynistic, so I can understand how someone might see Helen O'Loy also part of that trend. However, I strongly disagree, profoundly disagree. If this was the level that I disagree, there's just no space. I could not disagree more. Rather than embodying the misogynistic attitudes of the time, I think, in my opinion, Del Rey actually satirizes those exact attitudes. So it's not a sexist story, it's a story about sexist character that exists in a patriarchal, deeply hierarchical society that views not only women, but also people, all people, as objects. Now, I don't really know what Del Rey was thinking, what his attitude was towards this thing, etc. I don't know that much about him. I can only speculate, but there are, in my opinion, enough hints in the story that I don't see any other possible interpretation. There's even a minor subplot in the story where Phil, the endocrinologist and the narrator of the story, has to go and cure a young rich man from falling in love with his maid by injecting him against his will with an artificial hormone to stop him being in love. So this is the kind of society that the story takes place. This is the kind of context that the characters exist in. And as I've said many times in this channel, context matters. And I want to emphasize that the narrator is not objective. He is subjective and even unreliable. That is the biggest hint of all. Fundamentally, this is a story about two chauvinistic, selfish, and immature young men who, against all odds, see their male fantasy come to life, and as a result, they become slaves to that fantasy. In a weird, twisted way, it ruins their lives. I don't want to delve too deep into an analysis of this particular story because that's not the point of this video. Perhaps that will be another video, who knows. But it was nominated for Retro Hugo in 2014. It came in second, I think. So it's possible it has been reevaluated somewhat more recently, although I still think most people view it as a misogynistic story, and I think that comes from a deep misunderstanding of what this story is trying to say. Who knows? Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, as far as Asimov goes, because that's what this video is about, I don't see this as a big influence for his early robot stories, but maybe it does influence him a little bit in his later stories, like The Bicentennial Man. Even so, Helen O'Loy does explore the idea of robots being an ordinary, widespread industry that primarily caters to service role, like a housekeeper. Aside from Helen, that's how robots are used mostly in the story, and that's how they are used in most of Asimov's stories as well. Of course, I had to end this list with I, Robot. No, not the Asimov book, and no, not the Will Smith movie, but I, Robot, the short story by Eando Binder, which preceded both. Published in January of 1939, I, Robot is another interesting twist on the Frankenstein story. Much like in The Lost Machine, the story features a first-person narration from the titular robot named Adam Link, who is falsely accused of killing his creator. The villagers chase him around, kill his dog, corner him, and seemingly give him no choice but to commit violence to survive. Adam, however, refuses, opting instead to shut himself off rather than to kill a human being. So actually in many ways quite similar to The Lost Machine, but with a few minor differences here and there. I, Robot became popular enough upon publication that the writer, Eando Binder, turned it into a series, the Adam Link series, after the name of the robot in the story. They published a total of 10 stories between 1939 and 1942. Eando, by the way, is the pen name for Earl and Otto Binder, although by 1939, I believe Earl had retired, so it was just Otto, but he decided to keep the same pen name. The series is pretty entertaining to read in a fairly standard adventure science fiction way, with some thought-provoking scenarios thrown in here and there. To me, the fiction felt as sort of existing between the standards of the pulp and Golden Age science fiction, possessing elements of both, which I think was typical of amazing stories at this time. Every story that I read in the series ends in a sort of a cliffhanger, usually with some disappointment that Adam Link faces trying to exist in a society that doesn't accept him, and usually that cliffhanger is resolved at the beginning of the next story. The man knew what he was doing. And for example, in the second story, The Trial of Adam Link, he is convicted for the murder of his creator, and the story ends with Adam in a jail cell awaiting his execution, only to be pardoned at the beginning of the next story. And the stories often reference Frankenstein in some way. In the fourth one, for example, Adam gets a lady robot friend. They call her Eve. Obviously, when Asimov published his first book in the robot series, I, Robot, he borrowed the title of the first Adam Link story. It was the publisher's idea, despite Asimov's objection to this choice. Here's how James Gunn puts it in his book on Asimov. In 1950, when Martin Greenberg of Gnome Press was preparing to publish the book, Greenberg dismissed Asimov's suggested title, Mind and Iron, a phrase used in the introduction, and suggested I, Robot. Asimov said that was impossible because of Binder's earlier story. Fuck Eando Binder, Greenberg said, and I, Robot it was. I guess that's publishers for you. I love this quote. The similarities run deeper than just the title, however. Both worlds feature noble robots that are of unilateral help to humanity despite the latter's trepidations. In Asimov's case, this is mostly in the first story. Eventually, the robots become quite ubiquitous and accepted. The first Asimov story, Robbie, does also play with the inversion of the Frankenstein trope, much like the Adam Link stories do. Moreover, in the Adam Link universe, the robots have an iridium sponge brain that is the secret sauce of what makes them work, whereas in Asimov stories, we have the famous positronic brain. The two mirror each other pretty closely. It's obvious after you read both of them that Asimov just took the same idea and replaced one fancy science word with another. Asimov wrote his first robot story, Robbie, immediately after the fourth Adam Link story was published. This was not a coincidence, according to Asimov's own biography. He was specifically inspired by the story to write Robbie, which he did in a few weeks. Interestingly enough, the fourth Adam Link story, Adam Link's Vengeance, features something similar to the first law of robotics when Adam Link says, "A robot must never kill a human of his own free will. It was a thing I would never do." Asimov's first story does not feature any laws of robotics as far as I remember. They don't appear until the third story, I think. But we can assume that he was probably thinking about it this whole time. Adam Link states this as a choice or an ethical code that he's decided to adopt, whereas, as we know, in Asimov, the laws are nearly inseparable from the positronic brain. I mean, it's all a literary device anyway, so it doesn't matter, but I guess it is a meaningful distinction in how the series unfolds later on. Still, I don't believe that robots with a clear, explicitly stated ethical code existed before the Adam Link series, so Binder deserves some credit for inspiring that trend. It's probably the biggest inspiration to Asimov than every other story that I mentioned so far in this video. For all his talent and imagination, I don't think we get Asimov's I, Robot without Binder's I, Robot. So what do we make of all this? Obviously, I might have missed some story or other. I wouldn't claim that my list is exhaustive, although I do hope that it represents a good sample of the type of stories that Asimov would have read and been inspired by at this time. If I missed a story, feel free to leave it in the comments. I'm always looking for more reading material. I hope you did find it interesting, at least in some way. Honestly, I don't know that anyone besides myself enjoys this stuff or cares about this stuff, but I don't know, I always found it fascinating. I think it's important to investigate history in this way. We as humans have a tendency to hero worship, to break down progress as acts of one great man after another, but it never really happens that way. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Whether it is fiction or science or anything else, things gradually build on top of another. And that's true even for a writer of legendary status like Asimov. We all stand in the shoulders of giants. It's also a good reminder that though this era of science fiction, the pulp era, is somewhat looked down upon and overshadowed by the golden age that came afterwards, it was nevertheless a fertile breeding ground for creativity and experimentation, to which later and more successful writers owed a lot. So let's throw some appreciation their way. And why not throw some appreciation my way as well, by liking this video and subscribing to this channel? Why not? Alright, that's it for this video. I think it's time that I got back to my reading, so you can go away now. Shoo, go away, I said. Go away. I said go.